time periods tonight and how you prove them. And the value of this is that if you do prove them scripturally, then you've got something tangible that you can form a vision in your mind. It's got tangible boundaries to it. It's not airy-fairy. You know exactly what God intended that we should understand about the future. I'd like you to join me, if you wouldn't mind, in Revelation 10. We want to start there because we have, of course, in that 10th chapter of the Apocalypse, the marvellous vision of the rainbowed angel. Now, it's just not about the rainbowed angel, but about the triumph of the rainbowed angel, because when we see him in verses 1 and 2, he's at the end of his military career. And what we see here, of course, is a wonderful vision of Christ and his saints, his bride, sharing the work of establishing the kingdom with him. We're just going to focus on one or two aspects of this, in particular the scroll that is in his hand. So let's just read the first two verses of Revelation 10 and see if we can pick up a couple of things out of this. And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and the rainbow, it's the rainbow referred to in chapter 4 and verse 3, by the way, which has a predominant colour, and that colour is green. And green is the colour of immortality, life. Bit of greenery around in Texas at the moment, isn't there? Because there's been a lot of water. And now there's warmth, so there's green in Texas. It's the colour of life. Goes on to say this, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little scroll open. And he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth. Now we're going to come back to those two things, the sea and the earth, in a moment. But initially I just want to focus briefly on that and then turn to that little scroll. Now there are two stages over a period of 40 years in which Christ will establish the kingdom of God. It is going to take that long, in fact. There's the first stage of his triumph over the sea. Now, did you see that he's seen here with his right foot upon the sea and his left foot on the earth? In other words, his feet are not moving. They have been planted. The 40 years of conquest is over. This is the triumph of the rainbowed angel. But when you have a look at this, there are these two stages. The first stage, of course, is the victory over the Gogian Confederacy at Armageddon. Now that's a relatively short battle. There's some mopping up to be done after it, but it's relatively short. It's called in Revelation 14, the chapter we just read, the harvest of the earth. Then we've got the victory over the European nations and the papacy. You see, the term sea refers to the Mediterranean Sea. So the events of Armageddon concern the powers around Israel, the Mediterranean Sea. But the term earth in the Apocalypse is used of Europe. It's the home base of Catholicism. Babylon the Great will be found there. And so, of course, this work of subduing the earth is going to take a little bit longer. It's called the vintage of the earth in Revelation chapter 14. So there is these two stages spread out over 40 years. The sea and the earth in that order. But this is the important thing about Revelation chapter 10. Everything else really doesn't make any sense without focusing on this. You see this scroll in the hand of the angel, and then you've got the arrow pointing up to the scroll at the top there. Well, this is what Brother Thomas says in Eureka, Volume 3, page 178. This little scroll is the most important fragment of the Apocalypse. It contains the catastrophe of the plot, without which all the rest would be of little interest to the believer. And he's exactly right, because what's in that scroll, of course, is the work of Christ and the saints over 40 years. It has within it the 7 thunder judgments, which are referred to, if you have a look at Revelation 10 and verse 4. It says, when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write. And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not. Now, why wasn't he allowed to write them? Well, because you see, if John wrote them down, then he would be outside of himself. John is going to be invited to actually eat this scroll. So the voice comes to him in verse 8. It says this, "And the voice which I heard from heaven spake unto me again and said, Go and take the little scroll which is open in the hand of the angel which stands upon the sea and upon the earth." You see, some people have suggested that John's not allowed to write what's in this scroll because it's too awful for human ears to hear. Now, that's not the reason. The reason is John is a representative of all the saints who will share in this work. And he's told to go to that angel, to take the initiative, go to the angel and say, "Give me that scroll." And that's what he does. And he does that on your behalf and on mine. And the angel says, "Good, eat it." In other words, make it part of yourself. What's in that scroll, these judgments that we poured out upon the earth, you're going to do it. Make it part of yourself today. You have to have a vision of what's before you. You have to be prepared to take that step like John did. And go and take that scroll and consume it. Make it your entire objective in life, to be there in the day when the kingdom of God is established. And it will be a work of 40 years. And Brother Thomas says this in Eureka about the length of this little scroll. It is a little scroll of judgment. The scroll is little, not the judgments. The scroll unrolled is not long. Whereas, he says, the seven-sealed scroll of the Apocalypse, extending from John's day to the time of the dead, is long. Upon its roll are inscribed judicial events extending over, in his case, of course, nearly 18 centuries. It's a little longer now. This is not the little scroll. This is not a little scroll, he says, but a very long one. A scroll extended gives us the idea of length, and this is representative of time. A little scroll is a short time in which things written therein are to be accomplished. A period, say, of 40 years, according to the testimony of Micah chapter 7, verses 14 to 17. Now, that's one of the Old Testament references to the 40-year period. There are others. But there are, of course, New Testament references we're going to have a look at, and we're going to have a look at the one in Revelation chapter 14 a little later on, which tells us there will be this 40-year period from Armageddon to the full establishment of the kingdom of God. Now, you may be familiar with this chart. It's been shown in many places, and it's really just a way of summarising, as best we can, the major events that will occur in what's called the Jubilee period. Now, we're going to focus initially on the 40-year period from Armageddon. You see the vertical line there to the blue line over on the right-hand side. That's the 40-year period. A little later on, I'm going to take you to Ezekiel, and we're going to demonstrate that there will in fact be a total of 50 years, and the 40, of course, is the latter portion of that 50 years. Now, that leaves 10. And that 10-year period, you can see there on the left-hand side of the chart, has certain things going on in it. There's the judgment seat that lasts for 1 year. There's the rejoicing of Christ with his bride, where he meets every member of his bride, that goes for 1 year, in the terms of Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 5. Now, a man wasn't allowed to go to war. He took a wife. No man in Israel ever did that. No man in Israel could stop working. Nobody ever did it. But Christ will. He'll spend 12 months after he's glorified his bride, meeting every individual member of that bride. Then you have 4 or 5 years of preparation of the saints, and that's one of the last works that the angels do before they step aside and retire and enjoy the work of their hands, as of course they did after 6 days of creative work in Genesis chapter 1. This will be 6 days of 1,000 years each. Then we have, of course, events prior to Armageddon. You've got the beginning of Elijah's mission 3.5 years before Armageddon. You have the subduing of the Arabs in the Sinaitic region by Christ and the saints to receive the Jews who will flee from the terrible oppressions of Gog and his invasion. You have the smiting and healing of Egypt after the main force of Gog has removed itself back to the land. So all of those things are going to go on prior to Armageddon. So you can see you need a 10-year period. In fact, I'm about, God willing, to do a Bible school, and I've got 6 sessions to talk about that 10 years, and it's not long enough. Okay, because there's far too many things in that 10 years to fit into a study, a full study of 5 or 6 sessions. Not many people really nowadays are familiar with what has to happen in that 10-year period. So it's very important to have a concept of it. because that's part of your vision. Now, the red line of Armageddon, of course, sees some major events occur. Perhaps the most important event in history. The Lord Jesus Christ turning up to establish the kingdom of God on the earth. And what flows from that is a whole series of events. And you can see there's an attempt there to try and put them into some kind of order in relation to each other. Now we're going to focus in particular on the 40 years, and you see that red box there with Catholic Europe destroyed, 30 years? We're going to have a look at that 30 years as well. That's what's called biblically the hour of judgment. And we'll come to that a little later on. So I can't see anybody's eyes glazing over just yet, so hopefully we haven't lost you. You see that top line there, that the judgment seat and the marriage of the Lamb result in Yahweh Sabaoth, he who will become armies, manifested in power for 40 years, but the glory of the saints will be unseen by the world. That's because we read in Zechariah 14 verses 6 and 7 that the glory of the saints will be held in. They will not shine forth in glory. They'll be out there working. They will appear as ordinary men, as angels often did in the past, as ordinary men to the rulers of the world. Their glory will be kept in. Why? Well, because Christ will not reveal it until he's revealed the false harlot, the system that claims to be the bride of Christ, the Roman Catholic Church, Babylon the Great. He will not reveal the glory of his bride until he has exposed the harlot for what she is. And that won't come until towards the end of that 40-year period. That's why you see down the bottom right-hand corner there, you've got the marriage supper of the Lamb. So the marriage occurs just after the glorification of the saints. But the marriage supper, where the marriage is finally celebrated, doesn't come until something like 45, 50 years later, or 40-something years later. And that will only be when he's exposed the harlot, the Catholic harlot. And that's the story, of course, of Revelation chapter 19. So this is what Revelation 10 is telling us. The 7 thunder judgments that are contained in this little scroll that will take 40 years to play out. Those 7 thunder judgments, of course, line up with the 7 campaigns of Joshua to take hold of the land, the 7 campaigns of David to subdue his enemies. That will be seen again in the 7 campaigns of our Lord Jesus Christ and his saints. And finally, we'll have the triumph of the rainbow angel. Feet firmly planted, right foot upon the sea, the Mediterranean area, and left foot upon the Roman earth. Got it? Okay, well that's the introduction. And here's the summary. The subjugation of the nations over 40 years. This is just picking the main events. Armageddon. We'll see the Gogian host destroyed in the land. The Tarshish powers will be humbled by that whole event. There will be a proclamation to the nation to submit, and that will take 10 years to accomplish. Britain and other sensible nations, perhaps America, if they have a sensible president, will submit to Christ. The Catholic nations of Europe, however, and perhaps elsewhere, will unite behind the Pope. And there will be a lull in that 10 years before the final storm of 30 years breaks out upon Catholic Europe. And the first major event of that 30-year or 1 hour period is the destruction of the city of Rome, which they will be rebuilding, because it will have been, of course, severely damaged in the events of Armageddon, like all cities will have been damaged. But they'll be rebuilding it. They'll make it the capital of the kingdom of the papacy, the kingdom of men that has to be destroyed by Christ. So he makes a final plea for the nations to submit, and they laugh him to scorn. So the nations of Europe have to be subdued by 30 years of intense conflict. And it's just at this time, of course, that Elijah has the Jews, whom he's gathered from all the nations of the earth. He now has them in the body of Europe. And they will be in the wilderness of the peoples, as it's called in Ezekiel chapter 20. And they are going to be like a horse in the wilderness, as we're told in Isaiah 63 and verse 13. And we'll come to those things a little later on. Papal power will finally be utterly destroyed, and all its adherents will be gone. And all nations, after 40 years of conflict, will be subdued under Christ's rule. That's the content of this little scroll that is in the hand of the mighty rainbowed angel. And we, of course, are potentially constituent members of that angel, part of that cloud that enshrouds this mighty angel. Now, the story is set out in this chart. Bearing in mind, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, you have that upright, that vertical line, the time of Armageddon. Bearing in mind that Christ has come 10 years prior to that to raise the dead and to prepare his army for the things that are contained in this chart. Now, this red line that you can see that goes up and down, as you can see from the green at the heading of this slide, is the pattern of Roman Catholic resistance to Christ for 40 years after Armageddon. They will suffer a massive blow as a result. You see this line coming down here? Right? They will suffer a massive blow as a result of Armageddon, but they will rebuild in this 10 years after Armageddon. Now, that's the subject of Psalm 2. Psalm 2 is fabulous. It gives you details of what's going to happen after Armageddon. Then we've got Revelation 14 verse 8, which is the time of the destruction of Rome. That's this period here, 10 years after Armageddon. Now that's another massive blow for the papacy. But guess what? The Pope, who was in the Vatican, if there is a Vatican then, will go down the gurgler with Rome. But that won't stop the Roman Catholic Church. They will resort to Central Europe and elect a new Pope. And there might be a series of popes after him, because another 30 years to go yet before that system's destroyed. And they will recreate in Central Europe what the European Union was designed to create, and will probably fail to do so. The Holy Roman Empire. The Fourth Reich. That's what they'll create in Central Europe. And Christ and the saints will have to destroy it. And when we read of the beast and the false prophet that we'll come to later on in Revelation 19 verse 20, Brother Thomas points out quite correctly that that beast is the revived Holy Roman Empire, the eighth head of Revelation chapter 17. So what we have here then is really the 40 years unfolding as we read in that 14th chapter of the Apocalypse. What you have there is two parts to that chapter, and I'll give you a summary of it in a moment. Two parts to it. And towards the end, you have this description of Armageddon as the harvest of the earth. Now, Armageddon, of course, means a heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. So this is the harvest of the earth. Then you have the treading out, as we read, of the winepress of the wrath of God. That's the vintage of the earth. And that will go on for 40 years, and the most intense period of that is the last 30 years of the 40. And then you have the destruction of the papacy and the beast that supports him at the end. So there's three phases. That's why it says in Revelation 16 verse 18 that the great city, Babylon the Great, is divided into three parts. Yeah, there are three stages to its destruction, and that's the order. And this is how it will be done. This is the second Exodus of Israel, which will take the same length of time as the first Exodus. That's why we read in Isaiah 11 that Yahweh will at that time set his hand the second time to bring his people out of and the nations. And they include Shinar, right, Babylon. Right, so we know that this is the second Exodus that's being referred to. It will last for 40 years. And that's the point of Micah 7 verse 15, because that's about the second Exodus too. And it says that that nation, Israel, will be brought through the nations and they'll be shown marvellous things according to the time of the first Exodus. Yeah, 40 years. And that 40 years, of course, is spread out over that period we're talking about tonight. So Elijah's mission is to bring all of these Jews, and there are something like, they reckon, 10 to 12 million outside the land. We don't know the exact numbers. That will be less because of the events of Armageddon, which is going to see the destruction of billions of people. But it'll be millions of people that he brings into the body of Europe. This is called, as you can see in the middle of the screen in the purple, the wilderness of the peoples. Revelation 17 verse 3 tells us that a woman, the Catholic system, the mother of harlots, sits on a scarlet-coloured beast in a sea which is described as a wilderness. And then in Revelation 17 verse 15 we read what that sea represents. the sea, the waters whereupon the woman sat, are peoples and nations and tongues. Okay? So it's a wilderness of the sea. The sea represents nations or peoples. It's a wilderness of the peoples. There is only one wilderness of the peoples in the Bible, and it's that one. It's Europe, where Babylon the Great will have set up its power post-Armageddon to oppose the rule of Christ. And it will be the Jews, the horse in the wilderness, and the horse of Revelation 14 verse 20 that will bash their way through those nations, fight their way through those nations. And that will be the 30 years of conflict that's described as the hour of divine judgment. You see there that quotation from Micah 7 verses 15 and 16. According to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt, that is 40 years, will I show unto him marvellous things. The nations shall see and be confounded at all their might. That's what this is talking about. It's talking about that period where the Jews will have to fight their way through Europe, because those European nations will not permit them to return to the land. They will be saying that that man who claims to be the king of the Jews in Jerusalem is the Antichrist that we've been talking to you about for centuries. Oh yeah, we got the Jesuits to make the story up, but that's it, you see, it's a fulfilment. And so many people will be beguiled by that, as they are today. And so tragically, there'll have to be judgments brought to bear upon them. And in the process of those judgments, we read in Ezekiel 20, that will purge out the rebels in the nation of Israel returning under Elijah. So there's a two-edged sword being used here. Purging the Jews, destroying Catholic Europe in the process. So eventually they'll come back. They'll be brought back, baptised in the Euphrates and in the Red Sea, according to Isaiah 11 verses 11 to 16, and brought into the bonds of the covenant, according to Ezekiel chapter 20 and verses 35 to 38. So then, let's take a look at Revelation 14. So how are we going? Surviving? Okay, good. Revelation 14. Here is a break-up of this chapter and its contents. It is, of course, about the triumph of the Lamb and the redeemed that he has with him. And they are seen in verse 1. And I looked, and lo, a Lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000. Now this is, of course, the glorified, the exalted Mount Zion. And the redeemed are there. What brings that about? Well, of course, the events of Armageddon. That's implied in the earlier verses of this chapter, because when you come to verses 6 and 7, you have the mid-heaven proclamation that goes forth. Now this proclamation is going to last for 10 years. And the saints will be sent out as ambassadors to the nations, demanding that they submit to the rule of Christ. Psalm 2 talks about that. And why is it called mid-heaven? Well, in the scripture, heaven, of course, represents rulership or government, and earth represents ordinary people. So if you're flying in the midst of heaven, it means that you're talking to both. Now, what would happen if the saints went out and just talked to the rulers? Well, the rulers would do what they do today. They wouldn't tell the people the truth, would they? They would not tell the truth. So you see, when the saints go out after Armageddon to explain why the world is in absolute ruins, why 4 to 5 billion people lie dead unburied, they're going to have to explain why. But they're not just going to talk to rulers. They're going to talk to common people as well, so that everybody knows. And nobody will be able to say, well, look, no one told me. I didn't have a choice. They'll all have a choice. And if they choose to support the Pope against Christ, that's their doom. And it's on their own heads. That's why there's a mid-heaven proclamation. Verse 8 talks about the destruction of Rome. Now this is 10 years after Armageddon. Clearly in the context that's the case. In verses 9 to 11, there's a warning of judgment on the adherents of Catholicism. So you see, it's not as though Christ doesn't give them an opportunity. He gives them a lot of opportunities. But most people, of course, don't take it. Then you have what you might call the fulcrum of the chapter. It's verse 12. It sits there like a waymarker. The subject seems strange. But that's why, you see, it's telling you this chapter is divided into two parts. Verse 12 says, here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. And if they do, what are they going to be involved in? Well, now we read about all these angels who are coming out with a job to do. See, that's the work of the saints. Goes on to talk about that work. In verses 13 to 16 we have Armageddon, the harvest of the earth, and in verses 17 to 20 we have the vintage of the earth. Now it all lasts for 40 years. How do you prove that? Well, there's a secret code in Revelation chapter 14. A secret code. In verse 1 we read about 144,000. Now that's based upon Revelation chapter 7 verses 4 to 9. And if you go back to Revelation 7 you read about 12 tribes of Israel, each with 12,000 sealed. Now 12 times 12,000 is 144,000. To a Jew, 1,000 represented a family. Proof of that lies in Judges chapter 6 and verse 15, when Gideon said to the angel, my 1,000, that's not the way it's translated in the AV, but that's what the Hebrew is, my 1,000 is the least in Manasseh. 1,000? Yeah. You have father? 1. Produces children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, eventually gets 1,000. It may happen to Larry eventually. Get 1,000, okay? That's how they interpret it. 1,000 represents a family. And 12 is the number of Israel. Hence, using the square root principle, 144,000 represents the perfected family of Israel. An innumerable multitude of Jew and Gentile we read in Revelation chapter 7 verse 9. So 144,000 is simply a symbolic number. Okay? It's like a code, isn't it? The JW's got no idea about this. They think the 144,000 is a class of people who go off to heaven and the rest are left on earth. They have no idea. So if we've got the first verse of the chapter, they're using a secret code, well, why wouldn't that happen in verse 20? Look at Revelation 14 and verse 20. This is the last verse of the chapter. And it says this, and the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse bridles. Recall here that the horse is Israel. Isaiah 63 verse 13. Even unto the horse bridles by the space of 1,600 furlongs. Now 1,600 furlongs, this is not a lineal measure. This is not talking about literal blood up to the horse bridles for 1,600 furlongs. This is symbolic language, isn't it? Like the rest of the apocalypse. Largely symbolic language. It's actually talking about a time period. The space here is a time period. The length of the bloodshed involved in treading the winepress. So how do we interpret this? Well, just use the principle of verse 1. That was the square root principle. 12 times 12 is 144. 1,600 just happens to be 40 times 40. Now why would God do it that way? Well, he doesn't want everybody to know. It's like the Lord speaking parables to his own people. Why did he speak parables? He says that you disciples, you'll understand because you'll come and ask me. And you'll find out by diligent effort. But most of these people I'm talking to are not interested really. They will not understand. Alright? He spoke deliberately in parables for that reason. He's saying you need to make the effort and you need to have a key. Well, we got the key, we got the truth. Alright? And if you make the effort, you can understand. Pretty clear when you see it, isn't it? Square root principle. 40 times 40. Happy with that? Well, if you're not, I'm still going to move on. Okay? Because now I'm going to divide that 40 years up into two. Particularly focus on the 30 years, that's the latter portion of that 40 years. Now we read about 1 hour in the Apocalypse frequently. Let me just show you a couple of these. You're pretty close to chapter 17. Have a look at chapter 17 verse 12. Now these are about the 10 kings, and we'll talk about these a little later, if not tonight, tomorrow night, God willing. It says in verse 12, and the 10 horns which thou sawest 10 kings which have received no kingdom as yet, but received power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Well, that's not, I wouldn't have called that real power if it's literally 1 hour. That's not long, is it? That doesn't mean 1 literal hour. Actually means 30 years. Turn, just across the page, chapter 18. Have a look at verse 10. This is about the destruction of Babylon the Great. And these kings of the earth, of verse 9, it says, are standing afar off for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. Have a look at verse 17. For in 1 hour so great riches has come to naught. Have a look at the end of verse 19. For in 1 hour is she made desolate. So you got the idea? This is a repeated phrase in the Apocalypse. It's well worth going through and highlighting them. Every time you read that, except for the one in chapter 9, and I'll explain that in a minute, except for the one in chapter 9, every time you read that phrase, 1 hour, it represents 30 years. Now I'm going to give you 2 sets of proof. We're going to have a look at the mechanics of it. I'm going to have a look at history. You're going to see that it is, in fact, 1 hour represents 30 years. Well, Brother Thomas says this in Eureka Volume 2, page 361. Being then the 12th of a cycle, this is talking about 1 hour, the 12th of a cycle, it is also the hour of that cycle. The small cycle of light called a day, which is the root of all the greater cycles, was divided by the Jews into 12 equal parts, and the night into other 12. Now, we talk about 24 hours. Jews didn't talk about 24 hours. To them, a day was 12 hours, and a night was 12 hours. You put the two together, right, you get 24. But they focused on the day and the night. So we need to focus from a Jewish perspective, because this was written by a Jew for spiritual Jews. This is the only place in the Apocalypse, says Brother Thomas, and the other one is chapter 9 verse 15. Just turn back to chapter 9 verse 15. This is in the 6th trumpet period, the rise of the Turkish Empire, and you read this in verse 15. And the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, for to slay the 3rd part of men. Now, in fact, on the day for a year principle, that's 391 years and 1 month. You know where it was from? This is the rise of the Turks, the Turkomans, and there were 4 waves of them, came from beyond the Euphrates, and they did great destructive work against the Eastern Empire, and they overthrew, of course, Constantinople in 1453. Guess when it began? Well, it began on the 27th of April 1062, when Togrul Beg established himself in Islamic authority by marrying the Caliph's daughter, and it extends to the overthrow of Constantinople by Muhammad II on the 28th of May 1453. So guess how long that was? 391 years and 1 day. So you see, what Brother Thomas is going to say here is that because this hour of Revelation 9 is allied with other time periods like a month, a day, a year, etc., you don't interpret it the same way as when it only occurs as 1 hour. And he's quite right. Okay? He says it occurs in 7 other places after this. But in all these it stands alone and represents a judicial period of 30 years, or the 12th of a time. So how does he arrive at that? Well, let's have a look. These are the passages I just showed you a little while ago that mention this 1 hour. And we know the Scripture extensively uses the day for a year principle. And there are just a few of the passages that you can turn up. Genesis 47:9, Numbers 14:34, which of course says that for each day that you went through the land as spies, you're going to spend a year in the wilderness. Took them 40 days to spy out the land, 40 years in the wilderness, see? Day for a year principle. Ezekiel chapter 4 verses 4 to 6, Hosea 6:2, Luke 13:32, all say the same thing. So 1 hour is the 12th part of a Jewish day. 1/12 of a year, using the day for a year principle, is 1 month. And how many days were there in a Jewish month? Well, 30. So let's use the principle again. If there's 30 days, let's use the day for a year principle. How many you got? 30 years. But people say, but hang on, that's like the elastic band, you know, you sort of get it and... Yeah, because it's hidden. It's a secret code. How do we know it's right? Right? How do we know it's right? Well, we have historical proof. I want you to come to Revelation chapter 8 and verse 1. Revelation 8 verse 1 is the beginning of the opening of the seals, of the seventh seal, I should say. Verse 1 it says, "And when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour." Now what's that about? Well, it's about the victory of Constantine over Licinius in AD 324. Now we've just been to Istanbul, and there in the middle of Istanbul, as you go up the hill towards the restaurant district, guess what you see? This is the pillar of Constantine. It's been there since AD 324, right? That's when he made Constantinople, named after himself, the capital of the Roman Empire, because he just defeated the man who was in this area called Licinius, opposing him. He was now the sole ruler of the empire. And for the first time in many, many decades, the Roman Empire had peace. There was no longer any fighting in the empire. They had peace. Silence in heaven, it's called. Heaven, government. Silence in government. No challenges. All right? How long did that last? Well, that was 324 AD. He died in 337 AD, and it all fell apart. There was no longer silence in heaven. Well, that's 14 years. What it says here, there was silence in heaven about, not exactly, about the space of half an hour. Now 14 is pretty close to 15, isn't it? So if 15 is half an hour, what's 30? 1 hour. See? Now that's not the only proof. Come along to Revelation chapter 13. Chapter 11, verse 13. Revelation 11, verse 13. Now this is a chapter about the resurrection of the witnesses, and this of course is about the French Revolution. This is about the second great earthquake, just like the one in chapter 6 to 8 is the first great earthquake when Constantine overthrows the paganism of the Roman Empire and makes it Christian. That's a great earthquake. This is the second great earthquake of the apocalypse. The third, by the way, is in chapter 16. It's the overthrow of Babylon the Great itself. So here's the second great earthquake of the apocalypse. And we read in verse 13 about the French Revolution. "And the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell." Don't need to read the rest. So the same hour there was a great earthquake. How long did the French Revolution last? Well, it began in 1789. And historians will tell you that it ended in 1819. And in fact, 1820 begins the pouring out of the sixth vial of the wrath of God. And the first 5 vials have to do with the period of the French Revolution. So there is another proof. Okay? So how long is it from 1789 to 1819? 30 years. All right? You have 2 proofs in history that the apocalyptic 1 hour is 30 years. So you can look at it from the numeric side of it, the days, the years side of it. You can look at it from history. It's there. It's as solid as a rock that 1 hour is 30 years in the apocalypse. Well, I hope you managed that one, because now you're going to get another one. This one is about the 50 years, the overall period, the Jubilee period, into which the 40 and into that, the 30, fit. Okay? We want to have a look at the 50-year period. So now, having established we've got a 40-year period, which can be divided into 2 parts, 10 and 30, We now want to have a look at the 50-year period that you can divide into two parts, 40 and 10 at the front. I want you to come to Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel chapter 1. And we're going to read the first two verses. Now, I will put up on the screen in a moment where this comes from. It comes from chapter 2 of Brother Henry Sully's book, The Temple of Ezekiel's Prophecy. You will find it quoted in my own notes, the event subsequent to the return of Christ. As I said, there's not much I'm saying tonight that isn't found in the writings of our pioneers. So, Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 1. Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river of Kibar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Now the word God here is Elohim, meaning of course mighty ones. And what follows is a vision of the cherubim, of Christ and the saints in glory, performing the work of establishing the kingdom of God. And guess what you arrive at the end of Ezekiel chapter 1. You've got a throne with one sitting upon the throne, and guess what's over the throne? A rainbow. You don't get rainbows until the storm has passed. That's why there's a rainbow over the head of the rainbowed angel. He's at the end of his career. His feet are now no longer moving. They're not marching. He is victorious. That's why there's now peace. There's a rainbow. At the end of Ezekiel chapter 1, you have one of the few references to a rainbow. It's over the throne because the kingdom has been established and all the earth is at rest. That's the visions of mighty ones, of the Elohim. So you see, what we have here is a marvellous vision, and it's got timings added to it. Now some people think that because Ezekiel was a priest, that this is talking about the beginning of his ministry as a priest, because priests began to minister at age 30. Now that would be a terrific suggestion if it was right, but it's not right. You know why it's not right? Because there's a second timing given in verse 2. It says this: in the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th day of King Jehoiachin's captivity. Why two timings? Well, because you see, this is not about his age. This is about a particularly important year, which begins a cycle that now is referred to in Ezekiel 1 verse 1. 30 years prior to this. A very, very important year. We're going to go back and find out what that year was. But do you notice it says, of our captivity, Jehoiachin's captivity? You see that dotted line, bottom of the slide, you've got Jehoiachin's captivity, you've got a dotted line going up. Well, he only reigned for 3 months and 10 days and he was carted off to Babylon. That's Jehoiachin's captivity. So when is he talking here? Well, he says it's in the 5th year of our captivity. So Ezekiel is talking here 5 years, he begins this prophecy 5 years beyond the captivity of Jehoiachin. That's why you've got that dotted line that runs up there. So we go up to the top and we go back 30 years because it says it was in the 30th year. So go back 30 years. Where do you come to? Well, you come to the 18th year of Josiah. This is the year he found the book of the law. This is the year he sent a delegation to Huldah the prophetess to ask about the destiny of the nation. And God sent back the message to him saying, Josiah, your nation is doomed. You're wasting your time. You didn't stop working, but you're wasting your time. They're doomed. But you'll be in the kingdom. And I'll be very merciful to you. I'm going to kill you, which 13 years later he did. And Isaiah chimes in chapter 57 and verse 2 and says, none considereth that the righteous are removed, that they might not see the judgments that God will bring upon their people. God did that for Josiah. So his destiny was sealed, and so was his people's in this vital year. And he holds the greatest Passover in history in terms of the law. All futile, except for a few people like Daniel and his 3 friends and others. All futile. Very, very important year, that one. Extremely important year. We haven't quite finished yet. I want you to come to Ezekiel chapter 40. Ezekiel chapter 40. You read in verse 1 these words. In the 25th year of our captivity, in the beginning of the year. Now, you read this? 25th year of our captivity. So if the captivity is the captivity of Jehoiachin, come down 25 years, 20 years past Ezekiel chapter 1 verses 1 and 2. Alright? Got that? Well, he goes on to say this. In the beginning of the year, what's the beginning of the year? Well, Abib, the first month. In the 10th day of the month, what did they do on the 10th day of Abib? Well, they took the Passover lamb and inspected it for 5 days. Yeah. You know what this is telling us? It was exactly 50 years to the day from Josiah's great Passover. Exactly 50 years to the day. It's a Jubilee period, isn't it? Okay? So, what happens here then? And there's 2 dates given, because it goes on to say this in verse 1. In the 14th year after the city was smitten, so you can see there, you've got that 14 years at the end, at the fall of Jerusalem. It's 14 years after Jerusalem falls. It says this. In the selfsame day, the hand of Yahweh was upon me, and he brought me thither. In the visions of Elohim, visions of mighty ones, brought he me into the land of Israel. And he set me not upon, that word, El, means towards or near. He set me near a very high mountain. Now what would that be? Well, that's the exalted Mount Zion. By which, and that word by is again not rendered all that well. Thereupon, he says, was the frame of a city, not on, but from the south. So Ezekiel is actually positioned to the south of Mount Zion, and he looks at it and he sees this big building. It's like the frame of a city. Yeah, the temple is a mile square. Right? It's like the frame of a city. And what we have then, of course, is the description of that temple. Not being built, it's complete. You know why we know it's complete? Have a look at Ezekiel chapter 40 and verse 43. It says this. Then when he comes to the north side of this temple, and he goes through the gate, the 50 cubit gate, and he comes into the porch of the outer court, this is what he sees. Verse 43. And within were hooks and hand broad fastened round about upon the tables was the flesh of the offering. You know as well as I do, they do not start making sacrifices. Certainly if you work in a hospital, they do not start carving people up with operations that Dan looks at all day, right, until the building's finished. The building's got to be finished. This building is going into service. This is its first day of service. And Ezekiel is walked around this building, we read in chapter 40 verses 3 and 4, by the builder of the house. Now who would that be? The man with the lion in his hand, that's Christ. And Ezekiel is there to represent you and me, just like John was in Revelation chapter 10. He's there to represent the bride of Christ. So what's all this telling us, do you think? You know, I've had brethren say to me, I can't work that. I said, now listen, go away and do your own work. Go and get Brother Sally's book, have a good look at this, and then come back and tell me what you think. You know, every single one of them's come back and said, you know, he's right. Yeah, of course he's right. And it's been in our writings for a century. All right, it's there. It's this Jubilee period. It's from the 18th year of King Josiah, when he held his great Passover, when his destiny was sealed and his people's destiny was sealed. So will ours. At the resurrection and judgment seat, our destinies will be sealed. From that point, 50 years on, the temple will be complete and Christ will bring his bride into the house. The glory comes back through the east gate, remember? All right? He brings his bride into the house and he walks her around to see this house, and it's going into service that day. Exactly 50 years. All right? So it can be demonstrated. clearly demonstrated. Go to Brother Sally's book, Temple of Ezekiel's Prophecy, chapter 2 is devoted to that subject. So then in summary, what we've looked at is this period, the Jubilee period. It's a total of 50 years. Because we know the latter portion of that 50 years is the 40 years of Revelation 14 verse 20, that leaves the 10 up the front. And then you've got to start looking at what's going on in that 10 years, and there's a lot of things that have to happen in that period of time, including the resolution of our personal destinies. Hopefully, we're going to be there at the marriage of the Lamb. I don't know what it's like in America, but in Australia, weddings will last something like 7 or 8 hours, sometimes they're longer. The actual marrying process will take 35 to 40 minutes, but you don't get to sit down to eat until probably 5 or 6 hours later, because they've got to go away for photographs. There's all sorts of things going on. And you might not get your final course, like we didn't get our final course until 1 a.m. in the morning at one wedding, which started at 1:30 in the afternoon. I mention that because that's exactly what's going to happen again. And Christ will not be copying marriages in Australia, all right? He will wait until the temple is nearly complete. He will call his saints back when the work of destroying that system has been done. When that harlot system is revealed for what she is, he will then reveal his bride in all her glory to the nations who have submitted to him. Now, I don't know about time. I've gone on fairly long, but could you just give me another 5 or 10 minutes? I've got something really important I want to talk to you about. We've had a look at that chart, all right? Here it is again. The destruction of the papal system and the Holy Roman Empire that will support it will happen in 2060. I want you to come to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. We read in verse 8 of something that happens in this fourth beast, the Roman Empire period. He says, I considered the horns that were on this beast. These were the 10 horns formed by the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now, we don't have to argue about interpretation. You've only got to go to verses 23 to 27 that tells you what that's about. Okay? Tells you what it's about. What it's about, of course, is the history. Now, Sir Isaac Newton knew this. He knew this date at 2060. He was, of course, a noted mathematician, physicist and scientist. One of the greatest intellects of all time, they say. He certainly knew a bit about the truth. He wrote on religion. He rejected the Trinity as unscriptural, predicted 2060 as the year of the demise of the papacy, and he did this in the early 1700s. Now, how did you do that? Well, by interpreting the Bible on what it says. Simple as that. He had to keep his private papers secret, of course, for fear of the church. But Brother Stephen Snowballin, who lectures at the Halifax University, he's a student of Newton, he's seen his Bible. And in the margin of Newton's Bible, there's a note. Demise of the papacy, 2060. All right? Written with his hand. How did he get there? Well, he got there because he interpreted this prophecy. We just read it, didn't we? A little horn, of course, is the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. And it was preceded by the plucking up of 3 of the first horns, 3 of the barbarian powers that were formed on the body of the Roman Empire. Now, what happened historically was this. Towards the end of the 7th century, the emperors in the east, in Constantinople, decided to reject idols, idolatry. And they threw them out. And they called upon the Pope in the west to get rid of his idols. He said, go jump in the lake. Not interested. Well, he said, okay, well, row your own canoe then. Gave him no more support financially and did not send troops to protect him. So guess what the Lombards in northern Italy did? There were 3 Lombard kingdoms there. But guess what they did? They said, well, you beauty. So they made life very difficult for the Pope for decades, until he got sick of it. He couldn't get help from the emperors in the east, and he wasn't going to give up his idols. So he sent to Pepin the Short, king of France. And Pepin came down, and in a series of battles from 754 to 758 AD, he plucked up those three Lombard kingdoms, he destroyed their power, and he gave their territory to the Pope. And the Pope proceeded to create the triple tiara crown that you can see Pope Pius XII, the Second World War Pope, wearing. Alright? Triple tiara crown. Looks like a horn, doesn't it? Well, there were three horns, three kingdoms given to him to create another little horn. But of course the Holy Roman Empire didn't begin in 758. It began in 800 AD, when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, in the Vatican, by the way. And he became the protector of the church. So you had your two-horned lamb-like creature of Revelation chapter 13, verse 8. Two horns, papal emperor. Alright, this is the Holy Roman Empire. So when you look at the interpretation, it tells you what was going to happen. See the yellow there? He shall subdue three kings. Yep, we just talked about that. And he's given a time over which he has ascendancy against the saints, that is, any opposition to him. They will be given into his hand, it says, until a time and times and the dividing of time. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. So what is a time, times, and a dividing of time? Well, the Jewish year has 360 days in it. The one they brought back from Babylon, by the way. 360 days. So you've got, on the day for a year principle, 360 years, haven't you? So you've got a time, 360. You've got times, that's 2. That's 720. Plus a dividing, that's half, isn't it? That's 180. You've got 1260 days, or 1260 years, and it works like this. From AD 312, the triumph of Constantine, the Battle of Milvian Bridge, add 1260, you come down to 1572, to the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, when effective witnessing against the papacy came to an end. From AD 529, 533, the Justinian decretals, giving the Bishop of Rome headship of the church and political power in the west, add 1260. Comes to 1789 to 1793. The French Revolution began in 1789. It was at its height in the Reign of Terror in 1793, when they were cutting priests' heads off with a guillotine. Right? Papal power in France was gone, and effectively gone in Europe. In AD 608 to 610, the decree of focus granting the papacy temporal political power, that is, control over land and people, enormous power. Add 1260, you get to 1868 and 1870. In 1868, Garibaldi came up from Naples. He kicked the Pope out of Rome, and by 1870, the Pope had lost his temporal power. Called the First Vatican Council and declared himself to be infallible when he spoke ex cathedra. That was his response. But he was gone. No temporal power. You know, there is not one single acquisition of papal power in history, and they're the big ones, but the lesser ones are there too. There's not one that has not been terminated in exactly 1260 years. And not all this one failed. The Holy Roman Empire had two important dates at its inception. 758, Pepin, King of France, conquered 3 barbarian states in Italy, gave them to the Pope. That was actually humiliating for him. He accepted them. He created the crown, but it was humiliating. He had to be given these states by a French king, Catholic to be sure, but French king? Sorry. In 800 AD, Pope Leo, this is the boots on the other foot now, isn't it? The roles are reversed. Pope Leo crowned Charlemagne emperor. He's the son of Pepin, by the way. Made him emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. 800 AD, Christmas Day. You add 1260 to those two dates. 758 plus 1260 comes to 2018. You always get the reverse. If it was an indignation for the Pope to have to receive these 3 states from Pepin, then he's going to get back his dignity in Europe in 2018. And events are leading that way very quickly. You add 1260 to 800, the formation of the HRE, and you get to 2060, the end of the papal system. So how long have we got, you reckon? How long have we got? Given that there was a 50-year period between the resurrection of the dead and Christ walking his bride around the house. Now, be very careful in what I say, because I've been accused of things that I did not say. So people say, oh, if the Pope's destroyed in 2060 and you come back 50 years, that's 2010. Christ must have come 2010, one person concluded. That's ridiculous. Christ isn't in the earth yet. So how do we interpret this? So there's your break-up. You've got 50 years, resurrection, 10 years later, Armageddon, 40 years later, Christ walks his bride around the house. But the papacy is destroyed, along with its empire, in 2060. That's the only fixed date here. The only fixed date. So let's work around that. I want you to come finally to Revelation chapter 19. Revelation 19 and at verses 20 and 21. Verse 20 talks about the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet, the papacy, and they're destroyed. But verse 21 says this, and the remnant, this is the remnant of the Catholics who supported the Pope, the people that belonged to the empire that supported him. This is the European folk who'd been given their chance and didn't take it on several occasions. That's the remnant, was slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse. This is Christ upon Israel as his weapon. Okay? They're destroyed. How long will that take? Well, the length of that period will determine how long we have. It's already 5 years. It's already 5 years. So, if Christ had come in 2014, last year, then you add 50 years, Christ would walk his bride around the house in 2064. But he didn't come last year. If he comes in 2015 and you add 50 years, he will walk his bride around the house in 2065. Which means that the length of that tidy-up period of the remnant's 5 years. If he comes in 2016, then he'll walk his bride around the house in 2066. And the length of the period of clean-up is 6 years. And so on. Alright, you got the picture? I'm not telling you what year Christ is coming, I don't know. I do not know. I'm hoping it's this year. The signs are good, but I don't know. What I do know is there's a fixed date. And it's 2060. It will not fail. So if Christ doesn't come for another 10 years, it's a long clean-up period, isn't it? That's not going to happen. It's already 5 years. And I think probably that's enough. If it's not enough, how about 6? That's the number of the man and his system that he's destroying. We will see. We will see. But we are very, very close. No question about that. So let's get ready. All right, you've got a lot of work to do. 40 years of it, in fact, because the time to favour Zion has come.